Hi everyone, I'm Alexandra and I'm a student of University of Rizal System. So for today's topic, I'm going to discuss about the history of the transportation here in the Philippines. In today's time, transportation is very important to us, but in ancient times when transportation had not yet been invented, did you know that people back then only traveled by their foot from one place to another? Imagine, you walk 20,000 miles just to reach the place you go to every day. That is why the invention of transportation for our journey has been a huge help. According to my research, the first transportation we use here in the Philippines is the carabao. In ancient times, the carabao was a great help for every family in our country. It is also considered as the national animal of the Philippines. The carabao can pull a karatela with 6 or more people on board, which makes it a means of transportation. The carabao is the first kind of transportation in the Philippines during 16th century. This is what carabao transportation looks like. After the carabao transportation, the transportation in the Philippines evolved to kalesa. A kalesa is a two-wheeled horse-drawn carriage used in the Philippines. It was a primary mode of public and private transportation in the Philippines during the colonial era up until the 20th century. Though in modern times, they largely only survive as tourist attractions. Use of the kalesa declined after World War II, when mass public transportation was largely taken over by motorized jeepneys and tricycles. This is what kalesa looks like during colonial era. The next one is a tranvia or tramway. The tranvia was a streetcar system that served Manila and its surrounding cities during the early years of the 20th century. The tramway system began construction in 1885 as an enterprise of Don Jacobo Zobel, the Compañía de los Tranvías de Filipinas. The Malabon line was first to be accomplished in 1888, utilizing 8 passenger coaches and 4 German-manufactured steam locomotives. During the Spanish colonial era, the tramway was referred to as the Tranvías de Filipinas. Overall, the tramway provided a cheap, safe, and convenient means of transport within the city until the ouster of the Spanish regime by the US, when tram services dwindled in maintenance and capacity. This is the example of tranvia or tramway during the early years of the 20th century. After the tranvia's transportation in the Philippines, it evolves to jeepney. Jeepneys originate from the American colonial period shared taxis known as auto kalesas. This evolved to modified imported cars with attached carriage in the 1930s, which served as cheap passenger utility vehicles in Manila. The jeepney was invented after the damage dealt by World War II. The Philippines faced a post-war crisis of developing a new system of urban transportation. Within the urban area of Metro Manila, the cable cars that had once been used as primary form of transportation were now left in a state of ruin because of all the bombings that occurred in the city. However, a new system of mobilizing the urban population soon arose from all of this destruction. The Americans had abandoned Ford jeeps and local manufacturers modified them to accommodate more passengers. Despite having started as a temporary solution, jeepneys have evolved into a cultural symbol that now serves almost 40% of transport users in Metro Manila and surrounding provinces. This is the example of jeepney in the 1930s. The next transportation is a taxi. One of the largest companies in the city was Manila Yellow Taxi Company, was founded by attorney Enrique Monserrat Y. Calvo in February 1930. It was the first taxi company in the Philippines to import second-hand cars. Its first cab was a French Citroën in the 1950s. The taxis were mostly American cars: Chevrolet, Ford, Plymouth, and Studebaker. In the 1950s, A taxi rate was 15 centavos flag down and 5 centavos per half kilometer. This is the example of taxi. The next one is the airlines. On November 14, 1935, the Philippine Congress approved the franchise of Philippine Aerial Taxi Company Incorporated or PATCO to provide mail, cargo, and passenger service, particularly in the island of Luzon. The company then had scheduled Manila to Baguio and Manila to Paracal flights. The company became dormant for 6 years on its scheduled passenger operation under its assigned routes. This is the first airline in 1935. The next is the automobile. The first automobile car in the Philippines was George Richard automobile model in 1900s. La Estrella del Norte shipped from France to the Philippines a George Richard, the first ever automobile to have landed in the Philippines. Its owner was Dr. Misiano, a rich doctor. Cars, trucks, and motorcycles were introduced and made available in the country by trading companies as early as 1901. Although the US dollars was equivalent to 2 Philippine silver pesos during that period, the price of a motorized vehicle was considered a very large sum to carry around. This is the first automobile car in the Philippines, what looks like. The next transportation is the bus. A LATCO, now called Biltranco, established in Iriga City in July 1, 1914 by American serviceman Albert Louis Amen, was the first bus company in the Philippines and top bus liner in Bicol region back then. This is the example of bus during 1914. The next transportation is the light railway transit. On July 12, 1980, the country's President Ferdinand E. Marcos created the Light Rail Transit Authority, or LRTA, as a government agency. The chairman was the First Lady and Governor of Metro Manila, Imelda Romualdez Marcos. This LRTA confined its activities to determining policies, to the regulation and fixing fares, and to the planning of extensions to the system. The project was called Metro Rail and was operated by sister company of the former tramway company Meralco, called Metro Inc. This is the light railway transit way back 1980. The next transportation is a tricycle. Motorized tricycles, or simply tricycles, known in the rest of the world as a motorcycle and sidecar, are an indigenous form of the auto rickshaw and are common means of public and private transportation in the Philippines. These public utility vehicles either ply a set route or are for hire like taxis. The Boracay Budget Travel website says of the motorized cycle, the tricycle is the most popular means of transport in small towns and cities, especially in the rural areas. This is the example of tricycle way back then. The next transportation is the pedicab. The pedicab is a mixture words of pedal, referring to how the bike is powered, and cab referring to the sidecar that ferries people. It is also called the padjak or sikad, the equivalent of the phrase to pedal in Tagalog and Bisaya. Another name is tricycad in Bisaya, referring to the number of its wheels. The pedicab traces its roots to the cycle rickshaw that was borrowed from Japan, replacing the impractical man-pulled rickshaw. In Asia, the cycle rickshaw boom began in the 1920s in Singapore. Some would believe that the pedicab is the precursor to the tricycle, but the exact date of the introduction of both modes of transportation in the Philippines is unknown. In modern times, many things have changed, such as the development of our transportation. I can say that the Philippines has become developed in terms of transportation. It also includes the creativity of people's mind in inventing modern technologies because it makes our journey easier. And this is the end of the discussion about the history of the transportation here in the Philippines. Thank you for listening.